Assalamu alaikum students, here is 𝗬𝗏𝗃𝘀 and you're watching Learn English with 𝗬𝗏𝗃𝘀. Students, today we will be talking about an apology for poetry. Okay, what is an apology for poetry? It was a literary text that was written by Sidney in the favor of poetry. As you know, Aristotle, Plato attacked poetry, and throughout the history we are seeing people, some are against poetry and some are in the favor of poetry. So he was in the favor of poetry and he wrote down a literary text in 1585 and it was published in 1595 after 10 years. And it is considered, it is considered to be the pioneer of literary criticism in England, because it became the reason of literary criticism later on in England, because it critically evaluated poetry and its positive effects on the society were being judged by Sidney. So basically we divide an apology for poetry into two parts. First claims that poetry is of divine nature. First says that poetry is noble and divine and respectful and privileged, right? And the second one says that poetry is useful. Poetry has some utility, because mostly it is argued that poetry is useless, it corrupts society and it has no use of its own. So this thing was claimed that poetry is useful, it has the ability, it has some utility, and it is of divine nature. So different arguments were given to say that poetry is good, or different arguments were given in the favor, in the praise of poetry. So we will be discussing these arguments one by one. The first one was, it is the pioneer of civilization. So before any knowledge, before any science, before history, philosophy, science, physics, chemistry, whatever, poetry was the first one to be emerged. The first law was written in the form of verse, in the form of poetry, and Greek philosophers and historians were poets. So poetry was, mother of this civilization. Before any light, before any knowledge, there was poetry, and after that different sciences, knowledges came into being. So poetry is the mother, poetry is the pioneer, poetry is something founder of these knowledges, these sciences. Before anything there was poetry. Law was written in the form of poetry, and historians, philosophers, they were poets as well. So next one is, it is of divine nature. Poetry is considered to be divine throughout the world, most specifically in Christians, because in the Holy Bible, God and Solomon was praised in the form of verse, right? So poetry is something noble, respected, privileged, is given so much, privilege and nobility by the people. In different religions, it has its own, you can say it has its own space, it has its own worth and significance. Like in Quran Pak, it is in the form of ayah, which is in the form of verse, and similarly in different books. So next one is, it has the ability to teach and delight. I mean, poetry has the ability not only to delight us but to teach us, because when we read poetry we just don't get happy, we just don't get satisfied. Actually it's so hot here and I cannot turn on the fan because the video will be noisy, so for you guys. So it can teach, when we read poetry, it pleases us, it makes us happy, we get delighted. But similarly we are learning new things, like fun and learning together, because when we read something and we say this is good, this is bad, if you choose good this will happen, if you choose bad this will happen, and it indirectly teaches us to choose the right path instead of wrong, and to ignore the bad path instead of right. So this is how it teaches, as well as makes us happy, makes us satisfied. Next one is, it can surpass the virtue of history and philosophy. Students, poetry is somewhat superior than history and philosophy, because history tells you about universal truths, right? Philosophy tells you about the universal truths, and history tells you about the examples of it. But poetry merges these two fields together and gives the lasting impression to the reader, because when you read philosophy or history, it will not going to be so much lasting in your memory, but poetry will be, have the long lasting impact on your memory and on your judgments. So even if poetry changes reality or history, still you will going to believe that, because the way it is being told is so artistic and it is so kind of feel real and emotional. So this is how poetry can surpass the virtue of history. I mean, poetry can surpass the utility of history and philosophy. This is what was given by Sidney. So these arguments are not my own. It was given by Sidney. So you can, against them, you can say object them, but it was given by Sidney. So that was all today in this video lecture, and thank you. Keep watching my videos. Allah Hafiz.